The showers had been running for 10 minutes before anyone went in. The American corporal had turned the valves himself, checked the temperature, propped the door open, and stepped back. Warm water. Real warm water. Steady and clean, falling from 6 copper heads along the tiled wall. He had found soap. Plain, white, military issue, 1 bar per head. He had folded the towels on the bench outside. He had done everything right. He was sure of it. Then he called the women in. They came to the doorway and stopped. 15 of them, in worn coats and broken shoes, standing in a corridor that smelled of steam and clean water for the first time and longer than any of them could account for. They looked at the showers. They looked at the soap. They looked at the towels on the bench. Nobody moved. Not one of them crossed the threshold. The corporal waited. He looked at the translator. The translator looked at the women. The women looked at the floor, at the walls, at something just to the left of the open door, anywhere except inside, as though looking directly at the thing they were being offered might make it dangerous to want. Then the woman at the front spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look at anyone in particular. She said it the way you say something you already know the answer to but need to hear confirmed anyway. Is the water really for us? The translator repeated it in English. The words sat in the corridor for a moment. Between the steam and the silence and the 15 women who had not moved, the corporal opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He had no answer that felt adequate, because the question was not really about water. The camp sat in the countryside outside a small town in southern Germany, a converted agricultural compound that the Americans had taken over in the final weeks of the war and turned into a processing facility. It was not large, it was not comfortable, but it was organized. Meal schedules, medical checks, bunk assignments, work rosters, the infrastructure of a place that intended to function rather than simply contain. The women had arrived 2 days earlier, transferred from a collection point farther east where the end of the war had deposited them, along with everything else the collapse had swept loose. Former auxiliaries, most of them, clerks, radio operators, dispatch riders, girls who had been part of the machinery of the war and were now part of the machinery of its ending, processed through facilities that had procedures for most things, and were improvising the rest. They had not showered since before the transfer. Some had not showered since before that. The roads in the last weeks had offered nothing, no facilities, no privacy, no time. You moved or you didn't move, and if you moved dirty, and after long enough the dirt stopped feeling like something that could be changed and started feeling like something you simply were. The corporal's name was Davies. He was 24, from Georgia, had been in Europe for 11 months, and had learned to solve problems in the order they presented themselves without spending too much time on the ones that didn't have solutions. He had been assigned to the women's intake section 3 days ago, and had spent most of that time working through the list of things that needed doing. The showers were on the list. He had checked the plumbing himself on the first morning. 6 heads, all functional, hot water from the central boiler that served the main building. He had requisitioned soap from the supply officer, which had required 2 requests and a brief argument about priorities. He had found towels in a storage room, military issue, rough but clean. He had done everything on the list. He had not anticipated this. He looked at the women in the doorway and thought about what the question meant. Is the water really for us? Not. Can we use the water? Not. When do we go in? But is it real? Is it actually ours? Is there a version of this where it turns out not to be? He said, in the slow German he had been practicing since his 3rd week in the country. Yes, it is for you. Nobody moved. He said it again. Yes, for you. All of you. The woman at the front, the one who had asked, was perhaps 30, perhaps older. She had the posture of someone who had been in charge of something once and had not entirely let go of the habit. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read precisely. Not distrust, exactly. Something more careful than distrust. The expression of someone who has learned that good things announced too clearly sometimes disappear when you reach for them. She said something else. The translator said, "She asks if there is a time limit." Davies said, "No." The translator translated. The woman looked at the showers again. Then she looked at the other women behind her. Something passed between them. Not words, just a shift, a collective recalibration. Then she stepped through the door. The others followed. Slowly, one by one, the way people enter water they're not sure of yet, testing the temperature before committing. Davies and the translator moved back to give them space. Davies looked at his clipboard. Then he looked at the doorway. Then he looked at his clipboard again. From inside came the sound of the water changing, the rhythm of it shifting as people moved under it. The particular sound of a shower being used by someone who has not used one in a long time. No voices, no conversation. Just water and the occasional sound of a bar of soap being picked up and set down. Davies stood in the corridor and waited. After a few minutes, the translator said quietly, "How long do we give them?" Davies said, "As long as they need." The translator looked at him. Davies looked at his clipboard. The item on the list said, "Facilitate shower access for female detainees, 1,300 or 1,400 hours." It was already past 1,400. He crossed out the time. Inside, one of the women had started to cry. Not loudly. Davies could only tell because the sound changed. A breath that caught and didn't release cleanly. Then another. Then a third. Not all of them, but enough that the sound of the water carried it. Davies kept his eyes on the corridor wall. He had been in the field hospitals. He had seen worse things than women crying in a shower. But this was a different kind of worse. Not the worse of injury or loss, but the worse of something very small being given back to people who had been without it long enough to forget they were allowed to have it. The translator said nothing. Davies said nothing. They stood in the corridor and let the water run. The woman who had asked the question was the last one out. She came through the door with her hair wrapped in a towel, her old coat over her clean clothes, her broken shoes back on her feet because there was nothing else yet. She stopped in the corridor and looked at Davies. She said something. The translator said, "She says the water stayed warm the whole time." Davies said, "The boiler's good. It holds." The translator translated. The woman looked at him for a moment. Then she said something else, shorter. The translator paused before translating. Then he said, "She says she had forgotten that was possible." Davies didn't respond immediately. He looked at the woman, at her wrapped hair, and her worn coat, and her broken shoes and her face which had lost, somewhere in the last hour, the particular tension of someone waiting for the thing they've been given to be taken away. He said, "It'll be the same tomorrow." The translator translated. The woman looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the nod of someone filing information away rather than expressing gratitude, and walked back toward the barracks. Davies watched her go. Then he looked at his clipboard. The item was still there, crossed out time and all. He made a note beside it, completed, no incidents, and moved on to the next thing on the list. That evening, the camp medic stopped him in the yard and said, "The women's section was quiet tonight. No disturbances." Davies said, "I know." The medic said, "Whatever you did this afternoon, it worked." Davies thought about the question in the corridor. Is the water really for us? He thought about what it meant that 15 women had stood at the door of a working shower and needed to be told, twice, that it was permitted to go in. He said, "I turned on the showers." The medic looked at him. Davies looked at his clipboard. That was all he said about it. The next morning, before the 0700 count, he went to the shower room and turned the valves himself, checked the temperature, left soap on the ledge, folded towels on the bench outside. When the women came through for their morning rotation, the woman who had asked the question was at the front again. She stopped at the doorway. She looked at the steam, at the soap, at the towels. This time she didn't ask. She went in. The others followed. Davies stood in the corridor with his clipboard and listened to the water run and did not cross out the time, because this time he had written no time at all. Just showers. Daily. He had not told anyone to approve this. He had not filed a request. He had simply written it on the list and decided it was on the list. Nobody questioned it. The showers ran every morning for the remainder of the camp's operation. Hot water, soap, towels on the bench. The same every day. Not a gesture, not a reward, not something that could be taken away without explanation. Just something on the list. That was all it had needed to be.